In 1674, having suffered for more than 20 years with blindness, one of the world's greatest poets, John Milton, was laid to rest beneath the church in St. Giles, London. And just over a century later, in 1790, renovations to the church were underway, and as contractors dug through the clay, they unearthed the coffin of the man who had by then been consecrated into one of the niches of the Temple of British Worthies. And though the church's clergy had ordered his body to be reinterred, a group of enterprising parishioners disagreed and went their own way, and not only started to charge the public to view Milton's remains, but raised and raided his grave for relics of the poet to peddle to zealous collectors. Soon ringlets of Milton's hair made their way across the nation, falling into the hands of at least one known professional collector called Leigh Hunt. And it was one of Hunt's friends, the poet John Keats, who, on seeing a few strands of Milton's mane, penned a poem imaginatively named Lines on Seeing a Lock of Milton's Hair. And while he was there, he inspected an array of eminent specimens of Hunt's Protonaceous compilation of curls trimmed from the satirist Jonathan Swift and the critic Samuel Johnson, and Hunt's collection would eventually swell to include samples from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, Maria Edgeworth, Percy Shelley, Napoleon, and even George Washington himself, all of which are to this day on display in the Ransom Library at the University of Texas. And Milton's curls are not the only biological spoils to have been saved and made their way through the marketplace. Beyond Beethoven's quartets and concertos, sonatas and symphonies, strands of his hair have been scrutinized and analyzed and prized and have inspired 2 books and a film. In fact, John Keats' own hair is on display not 14 miles from our shul here at the Morgan Library on Madison Avenue. And all this talk of hair leads us into the lair of a solitary, sober and unshorn saint in the Jewish tradition, the Nazir. This morning we read of the Nazir's commitment to abstain from drink, to avoid shears and trims, and to evade the company of the deceased. And when the Nazir's period of penance comes to an end, the termination ceremony involves a rather unconventional ritual. He must shave his head and take his hair v'natan al ha'esh and place it on the flames of the altar. And our question, of course, is why? There is no imperative for the former pietist to end his or her sobriety with a drink, or to end their avoidance of death by attending a burial. So why must they crop their unmanicured cranium and incinerate their mane? To put it in a sentence, which religious or civic or spiritual value mandates this shave and insists that the Nazir cremates their biotic creation? And there are 2 diametrically opposed readings of this mandate by medieval masters that I'd like to share with you today, starting with the Chizkuni, for whom the answer to our question could not be any simpler. For him, the reason that the Nazir must burn their curls is Lefi Shehu Kadosh. The braids are sacred. The curls that emerge while pietists purge themselves of impurity attain a sheen of sanctity that necessitates ritual immolation. For the Chizkuni to depart the temple compound and roam unhallowed ground while crowned with consecrated braids would amount to a kind of desecration. It would be akin to tilling the earth with an animal reserved for the worship of heaven. For the Chizkuni, the Nazir's locks are like lahavdil, a samurai's top knot, or a Sikh's hair bun, where the strands are not simply symbolic, they are sacrosanct. But on the other hand, there is a view which sees these strands as the very opposite of sacrosanct, where the hair's growth is seen not as a sacred cultivation, but the product of a bid to rid oneself of sin. In the words of the Al-Sheikh, this shearing is a mashal el kritut haga'ava, a metaphor for excising pride. And this hair needs incinerating, for Shmuel Bornstein, the second Sokachov Rebbe, to avoid the metaphysical equivalent of nuclear fallout, shelo yitpashet mimenu koach ra'azeh, so that its evil power not spread any further. So for these mystics, the hair is not sacred, but dangerous. It isn't sacrosanct, but hazardous. Evil resides within its fibers, and malice is manifest in its strands. It is a noxious biotic toxin in need of ritual incineration to spare both its host and society of its ills. But there is a third reading, which strips the hair either of virtue or of vice, that sees the hair not as sacred or as a dangerous substance, but simply as a symbol, a material memory of a moment in time. And for Rabbi Zalman Sorotskin, the author of the Oznaim LaTorah, the very purpose of this burning is precisely to stop this symbol from being seen as a substance. It is to impede our natural predisposition to invest material objects with totemic or talismanic power. After days of sobriety and the absence of company, a Nazarite might be tempted to frame their braids as a relic of their saintliness, to imbue their hair with an air of eternity, whether as a sacred monument to their penitence or a profane incarnation of their exercised sin. And the very last thing for Sorotskin that God wants in the wake of any person's penitence is that they replace moral reflection with ritual objective projection, substituting spiritual transformation with superficial superstition. The last thing that God wants is for the Nazir to think that the whole purpose of their discipline was to produce an object rather than to attune their mind and induce more redemptive behavior. So the braids are cast into the flames to stop the saint from elevating them, to stop them from seeing them as innately sacred or innately profane, rather than merely a consequence of an abstinence intent on changing behavior. In the words of Rav Sorotskin, Pen yaniach et hasear lemishmeret, lest the Nazir hold onto their hair as a keepsake. Yisrof oto, it must be burned. The Nazir is to leave the temple not with a biotic relic, but a polished, empathetic sense. The Nazir is to emerge onto the world stage armed not with ritual braids, but a humane grace, not with hallowed or radioactive hair, but with self-awareness and care, not with consecrated curls or toxic tresses or sacred strands, but with integrity, sensitivity, and compassion. In the face of life's incline, it can be so tempting to endow external objects with religious power at the expense of scouring our souls for imperfection. It can be easier to rely on narrow ritual superstition than embark on a comprehensive mission of introspection. Religious life can seem less trying if enchanted objects offer us a mystic defense than if it requires an active offensive against malevolence. It is, in some ways, easier to frame Milton's braids than to read his poetry. It is simpler to display Washington's hair than to extend his philosophical legacy. It is less strenuous to admire the locks of saints than to perpetuate their valor and live lives that echo their integrity. But just like the Nazir, we are cautioned to see ritual objects as platforms for an inner transformation. We are summoned to do mitzvot, to keep our ritual commitments as a means to ready our minds for confrontation with self-interest and indifference and apathy and ignorance, and to direct the self toward a redemptive empathy and devotion. I remember when my grandmother passed away, and my father took me to her apartment and asked if there was anything that I wanted to take as a keepsake. And of course, I wanted to, but I felt conflicted. I was tempted to amass all sorts of mementos and reminders. And to this day, I have ties from my grandfather's collection that remind me of him. But I often feel the need to remind myself that these objects do not relieve me from the deeper obligation not simply to maintain memorabilia, but to keep their values alive. There are times when it may be necessary to indulge the senses in their need for concrete monuments, but there comes a time to draw a line and recognize that even meaningful monuments can incapacitate aspiration and serve as physical impediments to the project of spiritual betterment, and that it is the moral rather than the material landscape which matters most. May we all find ways to allow our ritual obligations to enrich our moral landscapes, to allow Jewish law to enrich human life, and to steer us as agents of God's will to bring blessing into our times. Shavua Tov.